and, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, certainly incapable of that. I think you tell one story that I think kind of crystallizes the problem with Black Lives Matter, which is when Lil Wayne, who was my favorite rapper growing up, um, he was on some mainstream news show. I forget which channel, and they asked him about Black Lives Matter, and he basically said, "Listen, that has nothing to do with me. I have like it's me and like my three homies. That's all I care about. Black Lives Matter. I don't know about that." He didn't directly say it was bad. He just refused to endorse it affirmatively, and he was pounced on. And so at the same time, he also gave just like a straightforward endorsement of gangbanging.
Yeah,
Right.
he raised his red bandana and said, "I'm a gangbanger."
He said, "I'm a gangbanger. Like I don't know about Black Lives Matter. I'm a gangbanger." And the response to this was to absolutely just, at least metaphorically, flog him publicly until he apologized for not endorsing Black Lives Matter. But it's fine that he's a gangbanger, right? No one forced him to apologize for giving a straightforward endorsement of a criminal lifestyle. But he had to apologize because he wasn't completely on board with Black Lives Matter, right? I think that crystallizes the problem, which is we are so focused on everyone falling into line behind Black Lives Matter that we're actually not having an honest conversation about crime, which is a huge problem that black people disproportionately face, right?
Well, what you're getting at too is I think a lot of people see someone like Lil Wayne, raise his bandana and they perceive that. And when I say a lot of people, really what we're talking about are people who shape mainstream narratives, right? So people in politics, people in academia, people in news media, they've gotten used to frankly seeing black men who participate in crime in what I consider to be a very dehumanizing sort of animalistic way, where they see us as simply the byproduct of circumstance. So they see Lil Wayne and they don't get offended by him glorifying gangbangers in a country where thousands and thousands of young black men die every year off of that sort of glorification. Because they look at these young black men and say, well, they're poor, they don't go to a good school, they don't have jobs in their community. They're supposed to have these problems. They look at it as if we are destined to suffer. And they really don't acknowledge our humanity, because if they did, they would look at someone like Lil Wayne and say, you know better than that. You're capable of better than that. Just as I would get mad at Donald Trump for saying something immoral on television, I should get mad at Lil Wayne the same exact way, because morality is supposed to be greater than how much money you have or what you look like. And yet they see Lil Wayne in this sense, and it's almost like this sort of, well, his behavior is just like they would say a squirrel running around and up a tree, right? It's like, this is what he's been programmed to do. And that's what's become so frustrating to me in the work I do, when young men are sort of seen in this way that just completely removes any sort of self-agency, any sort of inner power to be greater than your circumstances. And it's reserved for very few people, right? I mean, it's reserved for black men in many cases. It's not reserved the same way for the white guy who becomes a white supremacist or the white guy who shoots up his school. I think people are quicker to want to individualize that person's circumstances and say, well, you could have done better, right? Why are you hating? Why are you hating people? Why are you being violent? Why are you misogynist? But when it comes to us, it's like we're treated like subhuman. And it's people who claim to be our friend and our ally who are doing that, right? It's people who pat themselves on the back for saying, and they say, well, I'm not a racist because I'm not a Republican and I'm a progressive and I want universal health care. And they say all these things and they think that somehow justifies the way they perceive our community. And it breaks my heart, because it is a kind of racism that I encounter more than almost any other form, and yet is the hardest to have people talk about.
Right, because the moment you open the door to black people having just as much agency as every other race of people, then it's possible for a black person to really be responsible, to be blameworthy for themselves. Right? I think you talk about one of your friends who ended up in prison, and it seemed like he was kind of one of your best friends at a period in your life, maybe late teens or early 20s,
Yep.
maybe. And he ended up in prison. You didn't. You kind of admired him, and he admired you in some ways, but you were sort of going the more mainstream route after getting very close to having a life of crime. And there's this one point where he's kind of making excuses for why he's in prison, right? It's the world's fault. It's not his. And you trying to kind of suggest that, listen, man, like, you ended up here. Like, you didn't have to end up here. You made choices. And that was a really powerful moment. I have one family member who is in prison as well, and has this habit of constantly blaming the rest of the family for why he's in prison, right? And there's a sense in which you don't want to take responsibility, and there's a sense in which there's a narrative on the left that will cater to that delusion. There are some cases in which people are behind bars not of their own fault, and society really is to blame. But I don't think that's the majority of cases, and I don't think I don't think it's useful to train people to think of themselves as kind of weather vanes being blown left and right by societal forces. I think that's very disempowering. And you make a good point that we don't do this for anyone else. We don't do this for white supremacists. I mean, some people do it, actually. Some people will excuse even the most racist, vile alt-right person because, I don't know, globalization took away their
Economic anxiety.
right,
That's the term that gets used a lot.
So it does happen, but it's not taken that seriously. It is a mainstream, at least in academia, it's kind of a mainstream way of thinking about black criminals.